Every senator knows the House is now in the middle of an impeachment inquiry. Here in this chamber, the Senate has been considering the nomination of Dan Brouillette to be Energy Secretary, replacing Rick Perry. In my view, questions about Secretary Perry's conduct in Ukraine and what Mr. Brouillette may know about that conduct tie this nomination to the impeachment inquiry in an important way. I've come to believe that there are several significant unanswered questions about Secretary Perry's role in changing the board of a state-owned energy company called Naftogaz. With Secretary Perry, his campaign donors, and certain crooked associates of Rudy Giuliani stood to gain from those changes is something the Senate ought to be digging into. Secretary Perry's role in Donald Trump's scheme that we've been hearing about with respect to withholding a meeting of military aid until Ukrainian President Zelensky agreed to interfere in the 2020 elections in the United States. The investigations seem to be piling up. Every time a new piece of information comes to light, it raises yet more and more questions about schemes that sure look, based on the facts, to be corrupt. Somehow, Secretary Perry seems to be making his way out the door without facing much, if any, scrutiny. Now, the Senate is trying to fast-track his replacement. I'll just put it simply, enough. Enough. It's time for the Senate to get some answers instead of just saying everything is A-OK at the Energy Department. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to explain what this is all about. Mr. Perry is famously one of the three amigos who took control of U.S. ties with the Ukraine under the direction of the president and his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Secretary Perry attended President Zelensky's inauguration in May. They held a private meeting. It's been reported that Secretary Perry pushed President Zelensky to fire members of the board of Naftogaz, a Ukrainian energy giant, and replace them with Secretary Perry's own political donors. At a second meeting with Ukrainian government and energy secretary officials, Secretary Perry reportedly said that the entire board ought to be replaced. The Associated Press reported that one person who attended the meeting said, and I quote, he said he was floored by the American request because that person had always viewed the U.S. government as having a higher ethical standard. The changes Secretary Perry was seeking to lined up with changes sought by two shady characters named Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, associates of Rudy Giuliani's. They also wanted different leadership at Naftogaz. So I'm just going to read now from an Associated Press report. Quote, as Rudy Giuliani was pushing Ukrainian officials last spring to investigate one of Donald Trump's main political rivals, a group of individuals with ties to the president and his personal lawyer were also active in the former Soviet republic. Their aims were profit, not politics. Quote, this circle of businessmen and Republican donors touted connections to Giuliani and Trump while trying to install new management at the top of Ukraine's massive state gas company. Their plan was then to steer lucrative contracts to companies controlled by Trump allies, according to two people with knowledge of their plans, unquote. Federal prosecutors are now investigating Rudy Giuliani's role. A NAFTA official is reportedly cooperating in the investigation. And some of Rick Perry's political donors did get a lucrative oil and gas deal in Ukraine after Perry began pressuring the Ukrainian president for changes. Perry admits he was in contact with Giuliani about the Ukraine. It was also revealed in impeachment testimony that Perry was seemingly made aware in July of the Trump scheme, where it seems like everybody was involved in Ukraine. So, to get it straight, I think here's the bottom line. Secretary Perry has somehow managed to stay on the fringes of this whole scheme, but it sure looks to me like he was right at the heart of serious ethical compromises. President Trump has claimed he made the call to Ukraine's president that prompted the whistleblower's complaint at Perry's request. And everywhere you look in the Ukraine scandal, it looks like there's crooked behavior all over. Now, Mr. President, I have a hard time believing that Secretary Perry booked his own flights to these meetings, sauntered out the back door of the Energy Department, and freelanced his own shady Ukraine policy without anybody knowing about it. And that brings me back to the Brouillette nomination. Dan Brouillette is currently the Deputy Energy Secretary. He is the number 2 person at the department. He is the deputy to the amigo. So at his confirmation hearing, sitting on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which I at one time chaired, I thought it was important to ask Mr. Brouillette some basic questions about what I've outlined here. And what I wanted to know wasn't real complicated. Who did Secretary Perry meet with regarding Ukraine and NAFTA gas? He was a powerful guy, and he wielded major influence over a nation that's dependent on aid from the United States as it resists aggression by Russia. Who else was in the loop with Secretary Perry? Now, Deputy Secretary Brouillette acknowledged in my questions only that there were meetings, but provided no further details about who took part in them. In follow-up written questions, again, he just wasn't forthcoming. He wouldn't provide any answers. So I'm sending a letter to Deputy Secretary Brouillette to give him yet another chance to answer basic questions. To who was Mr. Brouillette referring to when he acknowledged that Perry held meetings on seeking changes at NAFTA gas? When and where did those meetings take place? Who outside the department did Secretary Perry speak to regarding changes in NAFTA gas and the substance of those communications? And then, whether department staff were involved in meetings at which changes to NAFTA gas leadership came up, who the staff were, and what materials were produced. And Mr. President, here, I'll just make it clear, I find it implausible that the Secretary of Energy just was unstaffed on all this. I would think for an important meeting like this, the Secretary Perry would have individuals from the Department of Energy who were involved in these discussions with that Mr. Brouillette has now acknowledged took place. But we can't get any names. We can't get any answers at all. And I think it is seriously an error for the Senate to just rush to this nomination without getting answers to the questions that I have outlined. Indictments are flying. Investigations reveal major wrongdoing. Every stone that gets overturned in this process reveals a lot more generally about a rotten scheme. And it just seems to me that Secretary Perry is a significant figure in this scandal, and he is just trying to get out of Dodge. So, to me, this ought to be an opportunity for this body, the United States Senate, to stand up and demand accountability from the Trump administration and all of those in the administration who can provide information that I think provides really a modest amount of information about discussions that could very well be relevant to this whole Ukraine scheme. Mr. Giuliani has already had associates indicted. And the more we learn, just yesterday, Mr. President, there were differences of opinion in the testimony about what Mr. Perry's involvement was all about. So practically every day, there are unanswered questions about this matter. So because I believe the Senate deserves to have answers to the questions I've raised, because I think that this is just accountability 101 to have this information, I will be voting no today on cloture. And my understanding is that no matter how the Senate is recorded today, there'll be some opportunity over the holiday break for senators, staff, and those who are doing investigative work in this to get more details. So I certainly think without the questions I've been asking and the modest amount of information they would disclose, information, frankly, I think Secretary Perry and the Energy Department and the Trump administration can produce quite quickly if they didn't want to spend their time stonewalling. I think, given that, it's just not responsible to advance this nomination through a affirmative cloture vote today. So I will be voting no. My hope is over the next week or so, we can start to get some answers to these basic questions. And I'll tell you, Mr. President, I've just gone through 5 town hall meetings at home, rural areas, urban areas. Everybody I represent at home thinks that there ought to be more accountability in Washington, D.C., rather than less. Without answers to the questions I've outlined today, there is no question that with respect to accountability, without answers to those questions, the Senate, by voting cloture today, will be settling for less.